Hi, everybody. Jim Ostrowski back with the Liberty Moving podcast. I'm going to talk about the Second Amendment today. It's a huge issue for me. I'm going to cover a lot of ground. There's a lot of new developments, and this is an issue I'm going to be covering quite a bit on the podcast because I think it's really the number one issue in politics, pretty much at any particular time. Given the nature of the state as the main threat to our liberty, the right of the people to bear arms is obviously, it's frankly the most important issue. So a little bit about my background. I'm not particularly a gun person. I'm not a hunter. But since I've been a libertarian, which is 41 years, which you already know since you saw the first few podcasts, I've obviously been a supporter of the right to bear arms. It's private property. You have a right to defend yourself. Obviously, a libertarian is going to be the strongest supporter of the Second Amendment. We've seen how some conservatives, after they're appointed to judgeships, tend to slide away or get squishy and wimpy. Frankly, libertarians do not, and they cannot and will not. So, next time there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court, pick a libertarian. I will not take the job, but so don't look my way. I'd like to think have enough experience and ability to do it, but I'm not interested in the job. But there's lots of good libertarians out there. I mean, I would throw out the name of Randy Barnett, although he would be considered to be too old because you got to get somebody young. There's a lot of good, libertarian law professors. If the president wants to know who I recommend, give me a call, and I'll let you know. So I've been litigating this issue. I've handled criminal cases, felonies, misdemeanors. I've handled cases suing to invalidate gun laws, criminal appeals involving the New York SAFE Act. Most recently, well, that's hard to say because I'm involved in so many cases, but I'm suing Governor Cuomo over the lockdown and Brandon Lewis from the Firing Pin in Western New York gun shop. He's one of our our lead plaintiff. And the Second Amendment was a key issue there. Many other issues raised. So we're litigating that currently, but most recently an older case that sort of dragged through the courts, no fault of my own. Not that I'm can't delay things at times, but this is sort of not my fault that it's taken so long. But the Libertarian Party of Erie County versus Cuomo once again. My old nemesis, as he was in the pork lawsuit, I believe, years ago. So that was dismissed at the trial court level, which was no surprise. We were up in the Second Circuit. Steve Filano and I drove all night to get there, back 2 Februaries ago. At that time, the NYSERPA case was pending in the Supreme Court, so we all sort of agreed, not that it's my call, but the court agreed that it would hold off until that decision came out. So a lot of time has passed. So what happened then is that NYSERPA, the court declared it moot, although there was strong dissenting opinions by the conservatives. And then the Attorney General, Letitia James, filed a letter saying, well, okay, I guess we should get a decision on this, and we're right. Now, I filed a letter, which I'm sure came to it as a shock to the court, but that this is my style. I said, well, no, we shouldn't submit this for a decision. We should rebrief it because there's been several new developments in the country that change the entire nature of the debate and show that our complaint was actually correct. Our complaint said that we need the right to bear arms to deter government tyranny. We've had the most unprecedented government tyranny in American history during the lockdown. I call it the government virus, particularly onerous in New York State. And then we had civil unrest, which was actually causally related to the lockdown because George Floyd, the media doesn't want you to know this, but George Floyd was laid off because of the lockdown in his particular state. And obviously that put him in a frame of mind that, from my understanding, was not his normal frame of mind in recent years, that he had gotten himself back together, whatever. I'm not going to get into the details of that. But then you have the reaction of George Floyd, which in some sense was, a reaction of that this was unjust. But it's also, it can't be denied that there's a lot of people who had no outlet for any of their normal passions in life hit the streets to protest. There's a lot of young people, they couldn't go to a sporting event, they couldn't go to a movie, they couldn't go anywhere. School is suspended, work is suspended. So this lockdown had a very negative effect on the social stability and the social order in the United States, leading to the riots. And then, of course, you had the left wing say that, excuse me, sorry, pre-virus dry cough. So then the left said, well, we're going to lock down we're going to not lock down, but we're going to defund the police. So I submitted this letter to the court and I said, let's rebrief this. I think our case is even stronger now. Now, what happened is they ignored my letter and they affirmed the decision. And we're going to, take it to the full court. They call it en banc or in bank in some circuits. It goes to the full court. Now, we had on that particular panel, we had a democratically appointed judge and two judges appointed by the first George Bush. There's 5 Trump judges on the court. We can't ignore the fact that politics matters, apparently. I'll get into the Ninth Circuit case where you could predict where they were going to come out by who appointed them. So we're going to go in next week and for a petition for rehearing. I'll get into some of the details. I can't get into the whole thing because it would take too long. So that's going on. And then also recently there was a decision out of the Ninth Circuit in Duncan v. Becerra, and that was filed on August 14th. The Second Circuit case was filed 3 days before that. That case basically said that the ban on high-capacity magazines is unconstitutional. Not to get into too much detail on that, but the significant thing about that case is that the court held, it was opinion by Judge Kenneth Lee, who was a Trump appointee, joined in by a Bush 2 appointee and a dissent by a Clinton appointee. Wow. He applied strict scrutiny to this. He said this does burden the Second Amendment interest, and I'm going to apply strict scrutiny. And basically, when you apply strict scrutiny, you're generally speaking going to overturn the law. Now, in the Second Circuit, Judge Kearse, much over our protestation, that she applied the intermediate scrutiny, and I'll get into this a little bit today. Basically, intermediate scrutiny is the dissenting opinion of Judge Breyer and Heller, oddly enough. And I pointed this out to the court that this is adopting the losing position in Heller, and there's other problems with it, which I'll get into real quick today, and then in future podcasts, believe me, we'll go over all this in great detail. For those interested, and for those not, they can watch the other podcasts. But the main problem with intermediate scrutiny, if I can find my discussion now. Interestingly enough, this Libertarian Party v. Cuomo was basically a grassroots, shoestring case. I would be embarrassed to say how much I was paid to file it initially. And we're up against the Attorney General, which is one of the largest law firms in the state. We're also up against Bloomberg's gun group. They filed an amicus curiae, is a billionaire, and the Gabby Giffords group also filed a brief. And they are funded by some Silicon Valley, multi-billionaire. So, I was a little behind schedule in my reply brief, and I put in a proposed reply brief. A little late, I concede, but, no harm, no foul. What's the harm in adding more? My father was a judge for 30 years. He was a highly regarded judge. He always let people file extra briefs. He said, what's the harm? This is your chance to be heard. It's not going to kill anybody for me to read an extra brief. But apparently they didn't want my brief in front of the court. But in the reply brief, which of course I always recycle everything, I pointed out that in the intermediate scrutiny test, 0 weight is given to the values protected by the right to bear arms, and nearly absolute weight is given to the interest of the government. So basically, the intermediate scrutiny test is a sham. It's rigged to uphold gun laws, and it's not consistent with Heller or McDonald. So that's the argument basically that we're going to make to the full court, and we'll see what happens. If that's rejected, we're going to go to the Supreme Court, and that should be pretty interesting because we know that there's 4 judges on the Supreme Court who know that New York is ignoring their decisions. We don't know if there's a 5th vote for that. We also don't know if the composition of the court's going to change. We don't know who's going to win the election, although I'm on record saying that Trump's going to win the election, as I predicted in 2016. I also predicted, just by the way, for those who are not familiar with my record, I predicted pretty much how the primary was going to turn out in 16, and also how the primaries turned out in 2020. It's a little windy out today. That's why I'm in my garage studio, but the ever-present brick wall is here. So that's pending. The Ninth Circuit, I'm going to cite the Ninth Circuit case because that contradicts the Second Circuit on the standard of review. As always, our point is that we're going to not make hyper-technical legal arguments that some of the gun groups and some of the big law firms like to make. We're making the big argument, which is the purpose of the Second Amendment is to deter government tyranny. And we're not just bloviating there, because therefore your test has to change. So the Second Circuit so far has ignored that argument, made very clearly in the briefs and very clearly in oral argument. You can listen to the oral argument. I'll post it. If you follow me on Facebook or Twitter, I'll post it. If that's the purpose, then the test that the courts use to determine the validity of the law has to change. And nobody wants to accept the government tyranny argument because they don't have an answer to it. So basically, as in Libertarian Party, they basically ignored the government tyranny argument. They just literally ignored it. They ignored it in the Fourth Department, where we overturned the first SAFE Act conviction. They ignored it at the oral argument in the Fourth Department. They ignored it in the briefs, and the court didn't rule on the merits in that case. So they didn't deal with it there. Second Circuit, the Attorney General ignored it. The court ignored it at oral argument. And although I brought it up at oral argument, I said, for example, you can have elections. What if they cancel the elections? What are you going to do then? No answer. There is no answer. So I got those 2 cases going. I've got the lockdown case. We're filing a brief on Friday. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, I'm at this point, like, practicing law it's sort of part-time or whatever. Sometimes it seems like it's full-time. But I'm just doing this on the side of being, a liberty movement activist. But the fact that I'm involved in all these fights in the courts gives me a little bit, better perspective than some of the podcasters, because I'm in the trenches every day. I'm fighting the bad guys every day, and I've been doing it for a real long time. So again, why should you listen to the podcast? Why should you subscribe? Because I know what the hell I'm talking about. I'm not blowing smoke up your butt. So with that, I just want to point out that having been deluged by all these briefs and hundreds of pages of studies and so on by these gun control, think tanks, got me to thinking about a lot of these issues. We had a seminar, we had a meeting in Batavia a few years ago, basically about how to win this fight for the Second Amendment, because we appeared to be losing it at that time. And out of that conference, we decided that we needed to have a short primer on the Second Amendment, and I volunteered to write it. So that has actually been published. It's called The Second Amendment Works, a primer on how to defend our most important right. And this book is available on Amazon. It's priced very cheap for mass sales. If you want to buy in bulk, contact me. I'll give you a discount. But also it's on Steve Filano's site, it's 2anys.com. It's on that site for free downloading. Again, the Second Amendment Works. And in the book, I'll just sort of summarize the book a little bit, and I'll close for today, because I'm going to be pursuing this. I'm going to have Steve on the show in the next week or so to discuss. He's quickly become the number one, gun group in New York State, in my opinion. And I hope he keeps growing and really goes national. So, chapter 1, we're losing the fight for the Second Amendment. I lay out that case. I think it was actually, pretty obvious at that time that public opinion seemed to be drifting away. The lower courts had not been enforcing Heller and McDonald. So that was the point there. Chapter 2, and I wrote a book called Progressivism, a Primer. And the point I make in the gun book is that if you don't understand that the ideology behind gun control is progressivism, then you can't attack gun control. And the reason I wrote the book Progressivism is that nobody seemed to really have a firm grasp on what progressivism was. So in that book, I broke down progressivism and I dissected it, and I analyzed it and explained what it was and refuted it, and refuted it through theory and practice and history and examples and so on. And basically progressivism is this notion, as I say in the book, there's a governmental solution to every human problem that can be executed without serious cost or harmful consequences. That's what gun control is. It's not going to belabor the theory of progressivism, because it's in the book and it's in my other books, but the gun controller is trying to get this illusory sense of control over life. And this proposal of one more gun control law, and of course they're never done, which is another aspect of progressivism, that makes them feel good. It doesn't accomplish anything. It doesn't solve any problems. And it involves a lot of scapegoating of things that aren't really the cause of violence involving guns, but it makes them feel good, and that's what it's all about. There's no actual argument for it. In fact, I pointed out in the brief that was rejected, but I'm sure I pointed this out in other briefs that were accepted, that there's no actual formula, and this is true of the lockdown too. There's no actual, they can't prove that they can't prove that gun control works, because there isn't even a formula, an algebraic formula that would allow them to put a study together. He said, what are you talking about? You're just blowing smoke. There's nothing there. So then I go on, chapter 3, the left controls the idea of disseminating institutions. And I wrote a book called Government Schools Are Bad for Your Kids. And for 21 years, I've been telling the liberty movement, number one issue is government schools. Nobody listened to me. Look where we are now. We're screwed. We've given the left control of young children. And what do you think they did? They brainwashed them. So that's what that chapter is about. Chapter 4, the left has framed the debate to make sure we lose. I alluded to that earlier. So they ignore the government tyranny argument, and so everything is manipulated to help them win the argument. Because it gets into this cost-benefit analysis about crime and suicide and lost guns and kids getting guns and all this stuff. And none of that really has much to do with the Second Amendment. So they framed the issue to guarantee that we lose, and guess what? We're losing, except in Heller and McDonald. And the occasional lower court decision like the Ninth Circuit. So, and I could spend hours on this. This is a panoramic view. Chapter 5, the Second Amendment works. And what I tried to do here is do some, what I believe is original research, showing that the Second Amendment works if you understand what the purposes are. For example, I did research to show that coups d'etat are common in countries where there's not a well-armed civilian population. And the evidence is undeniable. And the old adage, I'm not going to cite statistics on the radio, but USA coups since 1946, 0. Per capita gun ownership world rank, 1. Per capita gun ownership per 100 persons, 120. The next closest, and then you get into the leader in coups, which is Thailand. They have 15 guns per 100, which is about 1/8 of the U.S., and they rank 50th. And it goes on and on from there. And believe me, I looked at the literature on coups, and I looked at a number of studies, several books. Couldn't find any discussion at all of civilian gun ownership. So I believe I've broken some new ground here. So you can send my Pulitzer to my house up in North Buffalo, or my Nobel, or whatever I'm never going to get. Sorry for that noise. So again, talking about coups, democide, which is murder by government, civil wars, shooting protesters, invasions, which is really interesting. We really haven't been invaded very often. I think the War of 1812 is probably the last, significant invasion. And by the way, in that war, the militia was a major factor. I know the militia, all the historians tending to be pro big government status, they're always downplaying the militia. Well, and even Washington, I listened to one of his books on bio, and he was not a particular huge fan of the militia. He had to concede that it saved his bacon late in the war down in the South. So concentration camps, again, we had the Japanese example, which was unfortunate. But so there's a lot of empirical research showing that there's a correlation. It's difficult to prove causation, but there's a very strong correlation. There's a logical connection between a well-armed civilian population and the avoidance of lots of really bad things that we've seen in other countries. So there's a lot of original research. I talk about collapsed democracies, which is really interesting because some of these collapsed democracies, which we don't have here so far, Italy, 1925, Mussolini took power by emergency law. A guy named Hitler took power in 1933 under, again, the Enabling Act of 1933. So just because you have a democracy doesn't mean it's going to stay a democracy. if you don't have a well-armed civilian population, it's going to say, well, maybe you pass some law, but we don't like it. And, we're going to resist. Batista took power with a collapsed democracy, and Castro took power. Really some interesting examples. You'll get a kick out of it. It's an easy read. You can read it in 3-4 hours max. The shooting of unarmed protesters, very common in other countries. Not common here, and I'm not talking about 4 people like at Kent State, where really not to justify anything, but I don't think anybody woke up that morning thinking I'm going to shoot protesters. I think there was what I'm saying is some of these other examples, where 379 people were killed, and 200 people were killed in Mozambique. China, 800 at least killed in Tiananmen Square. There was some serious intent to murder in those cases, and again, we haven't had that type of experience in the United States, generally speaking. So that's pretty much about it for the summary of the book. There's lots more stuff in there, refuting some of the comparisons between the United States and other countries. The countries that you should compare us to, as I did on page 55, you should compare us to Russia, China, Indonesia, Brazil, and India, because they're sort of large population countries, large geographic countries, and those comparisons do not lead you to say, well, we need to do what those countries are doing. And the point I make also in that chapter is this is the most successful country on earth. It's the country everybody wants to live in, apparently. We lead the world in legal immigration, attempted legal immigration, illegal immigration, attempted illegal immigration. So apparently having by far the most guns in the world is not inconsistent with being the most successful economy, the place where people vote with their feet to try to get here. So again, the Second Amendment works, and it's proven in the book in plain language. And then basically at the end, I could go on forever, but I want to wrap this up. We talk about some strategies such as juries. We're going to be talking about that a lot on this show. Jury nullification, trial jury nullification, grand jury nullification is also discussed, and a whole strategic vision, basically using mostly direct action. Forming new alliances. I talk about some of the minority groups that have been deprived of the right to bear arms, and we should at least reach out to them. We can't control if they're going to respond, but we should at least reach out to show our good faith. And lots of, at the end, there's a summary of strategies. So highly recommend this. Pick it up. It summarizes everything that I think a supporter of the right to bear arms needs to know. So again, I'm doing a lot of stuff, folks. We go from ranking the top 100 freest counties in the country, including factoring in right to bear arms, by the way, is 10% of the score. We're working on something involving paychecks, which I don't even want to get into. We're working on Second Amendment lawsuit, lockdown lawsuit, educational efforts. I've got so many darn ideas. If you want me to keep going, subscribe to the podcast, buy my books. I don't really do fundraising much, except on legal cases where it's really just necessary. So if you want to follow progress on these cases, subscribe to join Steve Filano's group. He's got a small monthly subscription, and I work with him. He works with me on these types of projects, and he can keep you posted. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, It's Jim Ostrowski on Twitter. And so that's pretty much an overview of what I'm doing on the Second Amendment. We're at 30 minutes, and that's my time limit. So I'll talk to you probably very soon. I'm going to have some interesting guests, some young libertarians. One of the things I'm trying to do is, 'cause I'm getting old, is identify young libertarians who will carry on this work well into the future. So over and out from the Liberty Moving Podcast in Buffalo, New York.